It's the best we have.
Okay.
I'm a big believer that because we're interconnected so profoundly across the world in our fate, whether it is environment, climate, nuclear war, pandemic, you name it. National borders are not so meaningful as
Mhm.
sometimes we think, but we got organized in a world of nation states, one that was largely built by European imperial powers in the 19th and 20th century. I believe we need global government, not as a sole government, obviously, but as a way to solve global problems.
Mhm.
And this is an idea that is essentially um, 1 century old. A, we never had global institutions until the middle of the 19th century, starting with the telegraph and postal
Yeah.
union, and the beginnings of global uh, pandemic preparedness, we'd say
Mhm.
now, but it was for infectious disease. That
Yeah.
was the beginning in the 1850s under European imperial uh, domination and control. But even then, that wasn't really a global government in any way. Then, after World War One, the idea was to create a League of Nations, and
Yeah.
that got started by the British and the U.S. In 1920, 21, but the U.S. decided not to join. So it was kind of stillborn, and it didn't prevent World War II, obviously. Then, in the middle of World War II, Franklin Roosevelt, who's my favorite all time president, said we need to try again with another organization. This time it ended not in Geneva, but on the East River, the United Nations. And it was born in 1945. It is only the second attempt in all of human history to have a universal body to address global scale issues. It's filled with problems. And one of the big problems is it was designed in a two-tiered way. 5 countries were given preeminence, that you can't do anything binding without their unanimous agreement. And
Yeah.
that is the US, and it was originally the Soviet Union, China, which was originally the nationalist China,
Mhm.
and Britain and France. So 5 powers, which we now call the P5, or the permanent 5 members of the Security Council, can veto anything that is binding and can block any change in the charter itself, that is the Constitution of the UN.
Mhm.
And then at the same time, it's also a universal body, but it has a single chamber, a little bit like the Senate, in that each state in the US gets 2 votes, but in the UN, each country gets 1 vote. And that's true whether you're Nauru, which is the smallest population of the 193 with 12,000 people, or China,
Mhm.
or now actually, I should say, up to date, India, which
India.
is now the most populous country, both China and India, 1.4 billion people. So they each get 1 vote. Now, this also has its problem, obviously, in terms of is that the right mode of representation of people around the world? So I've been donating, I'd say, most of my time in the last 25 years to the UN. I
Yeah.
am fully aware of all of the difficulties, contradictions, and so on. But I love the idea that 8 billion people through 193 representative national governments talk to each other at least.
Yeah. Talk to each other.
I love the idea of the UN Security Council, and I testified a couple of times in the UN Security Council in the last 2 years. And I love the idea that in a civilized way, no one's shooting at each other in the room, except through their verbal statements. They're actually talking. Does it work great? No, obviously it does not work great. Uh, could it be reformed? Absolutely. Again, we could have days of
Yeah, we could have
discussion
days
of
on that.
what to do. But what else are we going to do but to try to make it work and to understand that it's only the second attempt in the 300,000 years of our species to actually have global governance.
Yeah, and okay, well, that's I suppose puts it in perspective and explains why maybe new forms are required at some point. But you might say it's like democracy, the worst form of government except for all the rest. But uh,
Yeah,
uh,
but it also needs to be fixed,
yeah.
and this is part of the job of the 21st century.
I'm itching to get to recent affairs, but I can't resist, maybe because of my training with Noam Chomsky early on. Um, when you say, okay, Roosevelt, I mean, w given the makeup, especially the P5, would you not say that the desire was not to have a world government, but to divvy up the world for U.S. and for major power control, and the UN was a sort of a legitimizing force to allow the U.S. to appear to have international goals when really it was trying to control its hegemony. I'm going to be the devil's
Yeah,
advocate and say that.
no, I think at the time, Roosevelt, by the way, was really unusual in American leaders. He really was actually an anti-imperialist, and he really believed in economic rights, and he believed in human rights, and he was really an extraordinarily decent, unbelievably shrewd and effective and clever
Mm.
politician. So I really like him. From
Yeah.
everything I've studied over the last 50 years, I like him.
Okay.
Complicated personality, also, by the way, but
Yeah.
I like him a lot. Um, and I don't think that it was not to divvy up the world. He was no fan of the British Empire, which was
Mm.
the dominant empire
Mm.
up until the end of World War II. The United States became the dominant
Mm.
empire afterwards. But
Yes.
at a practical level, it was not actually to give control to the five. It was to give control to the one.
Yeah.
The United States was going to largely run the show,
Exactly. Yeah.
but had it been Roosevelt, uh, it actually would have run the show in a quite decent way. It would have decolonized the world. It would have made for good neighbors in Latin America. It would have done things that Roosevelt truly believed in. He submitted in 1944 to the U.S. Congress an economic Bill of Rights. His wife, after Roosevelt's death, Eleanor Roosevelt, presided over the promulgation and adoption of the Universal Declaration of Human
Hmm.
Rights. That was not a game. That was not a PR stunt. That was a very deeply moving, important step in our global evolution as humanity, to say that there are basic rights for all people as
Yeah.
individuals around the world and their human dignity. So now, has the UN served all these high purposes? Uh, Not quite. But at the same time, the bodies that have been created by the UN, UNESCO for education, science, and culture, for ITU for international telecommunications, WHO for the World Health Organization, and many others, are actually led. People say by international bureaucrats, but they're led by people who really believe in the international mission. They're they're multicultural, multinational, and above any other institution I know, they take a global perspective, which is very hard because if you're in the US, you're almost bound, compelled to take a national
Hmm.
perspective. Even if you're in a university, our universities are funded by the Defense Department, they're
Yes.
funded
Yeah.
by the State Department, they're funded by government grants. My colleagues are often aghast at what I say
Yeah.
because I don't take the US government line. Partly I'm not dependent on it, thank God. But, I find in the UN, the ethos really is different because people come from different countries. Now, the U.S. still, has its hand on things
Yeah.
through its share of the budget and so forth. But truly, among all of our imperfect institutions, if you want to hear an international point of view, not just a national government point of view, the UN is, you're going to hear it much more in the UN than typically you'd even hear in an East Coast university of the United States.
Okay, absolutely. No doubt about that. Universities are, yeah, are not, yeah. Okay, we won't get into that. But and so this is a great segue because people might imagine, based on your comments about Roosevelt and your and the fact that you have been a quote unquote insider in many ways, that you hew the insider line. And we're going to spend the next few minutes and not as much anywhere near as much as I'd like, uh, making it clear that you're not. We're going to talk about. I looked just at random at 9 pieces you've written, and we won't get through all 9, unfortunately. But they deal with Israel, Palestine, Ukraine, the CIA, U.S. foreign policy, in a way which, in almost every way, um, radically differs from the party line of what you'd hear in either mainstream media or in the U.S. government or in many other places. So let's talk about some things. And as I say, people should be prepared for arguments and discussions that are going to upset a lot of people, but it's important to have them. And I'm always impressed that you have the courage to state them. The first one is a framework, one you wrote in November 30th, early on, uh, relatively early on after October 7th, a framework for peace in Israel and Palestine, where you argued right off that the only way to end this was to welcome Palestine as a UN member state. This might shock some people that the first thing you do after what many people what many people claim is an unprovoked, or at least certainly an unacceptable and horrific act of terrorism, to recognize Palestine as a UN member state, um, with pre 1967 borders, and and why don't you just spend a few minutes talking about that?
Yeah, I think that there are two overarching issues I would say about all of my views. One is that any event is not really an event, it's part of a dynamic process.
Okay.
So you can never say, well, things started on October 7,
Yeah.
Hamas made an attack, or that Putin unprovoked attacked Ukraine on February 24th, 2022. So whenever you see in the media, which you see all the time,
Yeah.
unprovoked, it's
Yeah.
phony. As a physicist, you would say, the world is governed by dynamical processes. They could have some uncertainties in them in the wave equation, or in Newtonian mechanics. We thought we were able to predict everything about the future from knowing the current state. But in any event, there are dynamics,
Yeah.
and that is true. So never look at a snapshot. Always look at the dynamics. The second thing is there are two versions of the world, if I if I could simplify a little bit. The United States policy truly is that the US should run the show.
Hmm.
This is actually formal doctrine. If you read formal, boring doctrine, like the security strategy or defense strategy of the United States, or in the academic world, the grand strategy in the international relations literature of the United States is to be the predominant power, or sometimes called the hegemon, or
Hmm.
sometimes called the unipolar country. I really disagree with that philosophically, because we are 4.1% of the world population. Who the hell gave 4.1% of the world population the right to run the other 95.9% of the
Yeah.
world population? That's absurd. So these are the two predicates of almost everything I do, which is say, what are the dynamics here? So how do you help to move a more complex, multidimensional, dynamic system, if you were, if you want to put it that way? And second, don't take the U.S. line, take a global perspective, take a shared perspective. So when it comes to Israel and Palestine, there are two peoples, millions of each, on a common land. There is a long history of controversy about that, going back to the Balfour Declaration. There are heated ideological arguments on both sides. There are both sides saying the other doesn't belong here at all. And this is fraught with all of the heat, emotion, deep religious beliefs, and many other things that are part of this conflict. But it also has meant perpetual war uh, and perpetual cycles of war. And it has also meant, in my experience, in my view, tremendous suffering of the Palestinian people relative to the suffering of the Israeli Jewish people, because Israel, quote, won, and it has had the United States at its back. And the Palestinian people have suffered tremendously in this. Since 1967, after the Six-Day War, Israel has occupied the West Bank and Gaza and part of the Golan Heights and so on. And I first went to Israel in 1972 in about the same, it was the same summer vacation after high school that I visited my East German pen pal. And I went to Israel for the first time, and I was told a phrase called facts on the ground. That we are going to put settlements into these occupied, conquered lands to make facts on the ground so that we'll always control those places. I was kind of innocent then. I didn't really understand the significance of it, but 52 years later, I came to understand much sooner than that this is going to be a recipe for profound unhappiness, injustice, and violence. And it has been. So I believe that those facts on the ground weren't quite so factual or clever as they said. There are now hundreds of thousands of Israeli settlers in the West Bank.
700,000.
Yeah, and depending on where you draw
Nice.
lines and how you count, a couple 100,000 in East Jerusalem in some sense, or in the environment of East Jerusalem, and another 500,000 away from Jerusalem. And that has created a lot of zealotry as well, because a lot of these settlers have a religious,
Yeah, that's a
deeply
real, the messianic
embedded.
religious.
Yeah, exactly. And so they believe, well, God gave us this land and it's ours, and there's nothing more to say about it. So, to my mind, we've got to end this cycle of violence before it ends up killing everybody, including everybody, in an escalating global war. And the way to do it is to divide the territory according to international law that has been promulgated for the last 57 years since the Six-Day War. And by international law, I mean votes of the UN Security Council principally, because that has said we need two states. It should be on the borders of the 4th of June, 1967. And it seems to me that this is what bargaining theory calls the focal point for the bargain. It's the only one that has a plausibility that can actually reach an outcome short of all-out war. And so there are people who say, well, we should have one state, or we should have a binational state, or we should have a democratic state. There are others who say there should be no Israel, wipe it off the map. There are those that say there should be no Palestine, wipe it off the map. I believe that the way to get this cycle of extreme violence and cruelty over is to implement international law. And I think it's going to happen, actually, that Palestine will become the 194th member of the United Nations. The U.S. is going to fight against this, but in the end, I don't think the U.S. can block this from happening.
It's certainly
Israel, of course, is aghast at it,
yeah.
so what?
When you
You know,
say Israel's
Israel.
aghast, I think it's important to point out the government of Israel is aghast.
Yeah, that's. Let me put
I'm
it
not
that
sure
way.
the public
Exactly.
is
No,
fully.
you're right. I agree with you. I agree completely with you.
Now, I want to get to well, some key points which you make, which I think are interesting, that counter the general narrative. But one point I do want to say, people would counter you, say Israel isn't occupying Gaza because Israel removed itself in 2005 or so willingly, and it occupies the West Bank, but not Gaza. Would you at least agree with that or no?
No, not at all. You know,
Good.
if you have a prison uh, and the guards guard the inmates going in and out of their cells, but they don't live inside the cells, uh, I would say they're still occupying the prison,
Okay. Let me
and so that's what Gaza is.